Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we're going to talk about defensiveness.
Mm-hmm. No couple is immune to this.
No individual.
Or person.
Yeah.
Right. We see this as little as like our tots all the way through the lifespan. Defensiveness might look different by those ages, but it starts at a really young age.
It's probably one of the biggest issues that we experience, at least for me in the couples.
100%.
Couples realm. And then Gottman, of course, the researcher, defines defensiveness as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? It's a predictor that it will end in divorce if it's...
That name, that kills me.
Yeah.
But yes, it's one of the biggest predictors for divorce or separation of a marital or dating partnership.
It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And ultimately, like when you think about defensiveness, this is us defending our ego, right? We're defending our ego from a perceived attack. Like evolutionarily, it makes sense. Mm-hmm. Defensiveness, right? Let's, protect ourselves from
our ego or the ego of the one we love.
Our own.
I would say both, right? Because if someone's critical of, say, my sibling,
Got it. Yeah.
I might be fiercely defensive of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, I was looking at it in the context of a couple romantic relationship, but yeah,
true.
If somebody's attacking your wife, oh, here you go. What about parents?
Parents are never defensive.
When somebody says, "Oh, have you tried this new thing?" Our child's fine.
Or two kids fight every time. What did your child do? What happened? Wasn't mine. It's never yours.
Yeah. And maybe there's this less incentive to remedy this within like a stranger or somebody who, like a friend who's, just acquaintance that, because of your children or something. But in a romantic relationship, defensiveness is a huge predictor of what we just said of separation. So I always ask my couples when they're defensive, like, what are you defensive? What are you defending right now? And that's a hard question to answer. Like, what are you defending? And often I hear that I'm good enough.
Ooh, so they're introspective clients. Because sometimes it's more shallow than that, right?
It takes
simply
work to get there.
Because we haven't done the work to dig deeper. It can be, I'm defending that I think I'm right. It can be, I want you to hear me.
Yeah.
I want you to say you're sorry. I want to prove something, to win something.
Yeah. And I jumped a lot of steps. So you have to get through that, because then you're like, well, why do you need to be right? Because if I'm right, but once you get underneath all that, it's this idea of like, I'm afraid that I'm not good enough and they're going to leave me.
Yeah.
I'm defending that if I'm wrong enough or perceived to be wrong enough or not good enough, that I failed. And so they're defending that. And it makes sense. The question is when we're defending, does that give us an outcome that we're looking for?
The answer is a quick no. Defensiveness, to me, lacks a central component that we need in partnerships of curiosity or openness. I talk to partnerships quite a bit about how can you be curious with your partner? So if my husband comes home and he's really grouchy, instead of being like, why are you such an asshole today? Tempting sometimes.
That doesn't work?
Surprisingly, no. Tempting. Instead, getting curious. Hey, I'm noticing you seem tense, or I'm noticing that maybe you're upset. How can I support you? Or what's going on for you?
Yeah. Get
curious rather than going into my brain space of what did I do to piss them off? Tonight's going to be terrible. They're going to be grumpy, all the things that we do.
Yeah. And how you ask that is going to depend on the partner too, because some of them could be defensive if you label their emotion.
True.
Right.
Very
so
true.
Maybe just being more general, like what's going on for you. And that's the thing with defensiveness. The perceived attack is subjective. So what is it? And that's why I work with couples, is how do we be more effective with each other? Because what one finds as an attack might not be what the other perceives as an attack. So it's kind of like figuring out what exactly is the trigger for you. And it's not obviously on the partner's responsibility fully, but we can do things to help that process. And we'll get that here in a little bit when we talk about ways to remedy defensiveness or get out of that cycle.
So let's look at the different types of defensiveness, because defensiveness it sounds like a blanket or like one specific way of doing things, but it's actually a blanket term for quite a few different approaches within communication.
Yeah. We have the over explaining when you feel like you have to just, well, I didn't do this because, I was busy. And then I had to do this. And, I had all this stuff going on. Right.
We see this with boundary work, right? Shocker, I'm bringing up boundaries. But, right, if someone says, do you want to go get coffee? And the whole answer is no, thank you. That makes people so uncomfortable. We feel like we have to say, no, thank you, because, and then go on this long-winded spiel.
Mm-hmm.
That is part defensiveness, right? Or if we're making a parenting choice and say mother-in-law is critical of that, defending ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That defensiveness doesn't just show up in romantic partnerships, although it is there, of course.
Mm-hmm.
It shows up in all kinds of ways of over-explaining.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or justifying, right? You're over justifying. You feel like you have to defend yourself against this perceived attack from, and sometimes the other person may not have done anything, but there might be a history there of negative sentiment where you just automatically are assuming, right? Your mind reading that they're thinking that you're not a good parent or something. And then you have to defend this kind of insecurity too.
Often that piece of defensiveness actually makes things surprising, makes things a lot worse, right? Because now I'm trying to prove that it was a good enough reason. And chances are if someone's disappointed, they're going to be disappointed no matter what you say, barring any like emergency or catastrophe.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't actually accomplish what we want it to accomplish by alleviating their disappointment, frustration, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Other ways.
Stonewalling. So another of the 4 horsemen, stonewalling or walking away.
Yeah.
It's okay to take breaks in conflict and cool yourself down. When it becomes inappropriate or unhealthy is when I just disengage, when I shut my partner out, when they're talking and I walk away in the middle of their sentence. That can be a way of being defensive because now I'm not even hearing you. I'm shutting you out entirely. I'm
curious what your thoughts are. When I look at stonewall, I think of more a physiological response that isn't necessarily a choice of disengaging, but it's like fight, flight, or freeze. And at the same time, there must be a reason to defend that you're going in fight, flight, or freeze. So that one's either way, the disengagement.
Yeah.
And the reason why I bring that up is because I feel like sometimes it may not be a choice depending if they have a hyperactive autonomic nervous system or fight, flight, or freeze, which is a big difference in our perception of the partner who's being, withdrawn from.
And sometimes it is a choice, but you don't know you have a choice. Right.
Correct,
this is the pattern I learned growing up. This is the pattern I learned in a previous partnership.
Yeah.
And I'm going to live that same pattern out because I don't have other tools to use in my toolbox.
Yeah. But yeah, shutting down and just saying, I'm leaving this conversation or, minimizing it. This is not that big of a deal. Like dismissive.
Oh, I hear that all the time.
It's not that big of a deal. Calm down.
For those who aren't watching the video of this, my eye roll.
We call that contempt.
That phrase, never say calm down.
Yeah.
And I just say it doesn't help anything.
Well, what's interesting too is if you are experiencing defensiveness in a relationship, typically contempt is not too far behind.
True.
So it makes sense that you rolled your eyes when I said calm down.
We think it's so helpful. And it's not helpful. That phrase is just, it's not helpful.
So the ones that I like when I work with couples, I don't like them, but I think they're humorous, is the counter criticisms. Oh, I'll do this if you actually finally get to the trash.
I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
I would do the dishes if you.
Yeah.
I would calm down if you. There's always this if you.
Yeah.
Or,
when you.
Well, if you didn't do this in the first place, I wouldn't be here right now.
Yeah.
If you had done the dishes earlier, maybe I would have vacuumed. Hear it all the time.
Yeah.
Some other ones are, oh my gosh, I just lost my train of thought. Go ahead if you've got one.
There's one similar to that, and it's so there's a counter criticism, and then there's just the wow, I lost mine. That's wonderful.
Oh, God. I'm sorry, but or
the but language, yeah.
If you have to say but in a sentence, you've already negated whatever came before it. So I love you, but I'm sorry, but I will do that, but You have negated the front
Yeah.
half of that sentence. Those are not meant to be conditional statements. And you've now made them conditional.
Yeah. And even if you say, I hear you, but this is let me tell you what really happened.
I also have heard couples now getting a little bit craftier, and because I tell them the butt language has got to go.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say, I'm sorry, and I'm like, no.
That
Don't weaponize and, because now it's the same thing. I'm sorry, and you were also an asshole.
Yeah.
Not helpful, team.
Yeah.
Right?
I like that, the use of and now. That's brilliant.
Defensiveness can kind of come in almost like a cloak, right? It's happening before we even know it's happening.
Here's the other one that I lost my train of thought that's very similar. It's the diffusion of responsibility, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's like this idea of like, I didn't do that. You did. I didn't do this. You actually did this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not of like a tit for tat one. It's more of just like, I didn't, you did. Or this only happened because that happened. And it's really diffusing it from any responsibility of yourself.
And a more extreme version of that would be gaslighting, right? We've talked about that bit on here.
Yeah.
Of, I can't take accountability, or I don't want to, or it's too threatening to. And thus I'm going to flip the script on you. And that leads to our partner feeling crazy. That leads to our partner feeling like they're to blame. And it does build that contempt and resentment. And
that's exactly what defensiveness does. What you just said, it invalidates. Yeah. So then what do you think is going to happen when the partner feels invalidated or the other person feels invalidated? They're going to be defensive.
100%.
Or engaging.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. It doesn't get it. Protecting your ego does not win the battle by being defensive.
I tell couples, if one of you is winning, both of you are losing.
Yeah.
The goal cannot be to win. The goal is that we as a partnership are going to tackle this issue as a separate entity together as a team.
Yeah. And a way that I think about it too is if we're protecting our ego, we're not protecting our relationship.
Fair.
Because our focus is on preserving our own sense of self or self-esteem or whatever we feel is being attacked.
What's difficult about this is often when we are defensive, we come off as an asshole.
No, I don't. You do.
But actually, when I see people who are really defensive, my heart kind of gets sad because you can tell that they're wounded. Below that defensiveness, below the anger, could be pain, could be a sense of vulnerability, a sense of self-protection. If we can picture that in our partner, that can help soften it too, right? If I can picture my husband as someone who's vulnerable or injured, or even his childlike part, that all of a sudden softens my approach to his defensiveness in all of but a second, right? Whereas if I go in prepared to be like, he's such an asshole, it's not going to help anyone. It's going to make me more defensive, and we're just going to escalate. And even that statement, such an asshole, is actually a defensive statement protecting something else that we're defending. And it's defending this ego of like, they're going to see me as less than or not reciprocating or whatever the insecurity is. Or keeping the blame on them. Because if we keep the blame on them, then we're protecting what insecurity of our own? What is the insecurity we're protecting is the way I looked at it, because that's protecting something, right? And going in there just like assuming attack, which to be fair, there's relationships where you've got a highly critical partner. And what do you do but to defend if you're not actually removing yourself from it? And this is why in a lot of the forms of therapy, they soften the critic first, because then the person who's more distancing or defensive will come back. You have to create room. Yeah. Right. We have to create that space to feel safe before I'm going to come out of my shell. I'm not going to risk coming out of my shell until you're really ready to receive me in that self. Yeah. It's challenging because, again, these patterns can be enduring in that you learn them as a little pumpkin. So couples will come to me and they'll say, oh, we fought in front of our kids. I know we should never fight in front of our kids. Okay, quite the contrary. You should fight in front of your kids, but it's got to be healthy arguments with resolution. That is where we learn how to have conflict, how to seek resolution, how to come back together. What, as a partnership, do we hug afterwards? Do we say, I'm sorry in front of our kids? We don't want couples to actually go behind closed doors for every single argument and never show discord. Yeah. We want you to show how to disagree and disagree well. In a healthy way. Which does not include defensiveness. Yeah. Surprising. And if it is unhealthy, then maybe you do remember yourself. Yes. If it's escalating, either go behind closed doors, each of you cool down. But our hope is that in therapy is that we can give, say, parents the tools to be able to argue well, so we're not defensive. And then kids can learn that so they don't have to practice defensiveness when they're older.
Yeah. Or criticizing.
Yeah.
If they pick that up of like, this is how you argue, I just destroy the person.
And I hear people say that of, I'm really good at destroying people with my words.
And criticism is, to me, a protective thing too.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if I can hurt my partner, bring them down, I feel better about myself because I already feel less than. So I have to make them known that they're not as good as they think they are, or that I perceive that they think they are.
Or if I'm focusing on their weak points, they can't find mine.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about remedies for this. You already talked about one, which is if I can perceive that is coming from a hurt place in my partner. We're talking about compassion here. If we're having compassion, Michelle Becker talked about this in a previous episode.
That's softening.
It's softened because then we're not looking at them as this threat, which is what puts us in our defensive state. But we see that as they must be hurting. Now I can turn and lean in when I can see that. And it may be, the younger self that you're envisioning, like, wow, like what they're, doing right now in terms of criticizing me and yelling and screaming. It seems like this is probably what was happening when they were a younger child and helpless. That's this is ideal, right? This is very hard to do. Even us that have been practicing over a decade.
I'm perfect at this. I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know what you're talking about. And I would be compassionate only if you did X. The other one that I think is, and John Gottman talks about this as the remedy, is acceptance of influence or taking responsibility.
Which is so challenging because if I look at someone and I say, you're being defensive. No, I'm not. What are you talking about? Defensiveness is hard to catch in the moment because to even name it, there's not capacity for it sometimes.
It's very hard. And it's very hard to take responsibility largely because we assume that we're now surrendering. And the thing is what I would say we're doing is we're shifting from protecting the ego in hopes for repairing the relationship, which could actually then help the ego too, because you feel safe and secure. It sounds counterintuitive initially when we feel scared of it. But when we accept responsibility, it softens it completely. Both people, at least the other person that you're kind of acknowledging, like, I can see how my tone of voice really set this off. And, I'm sorry for that. And I know that wasn't right. What's their attack when somebody says, oh, and granted, there are going to be couples that are going to be like, yeah, you're right. It was your tone of voice. It was all your tone of voice. But in general, taking responsibility, even if out of 100 threads, 99 of them are not yours, you can find one thread you can take responsibility for.
It's true.
Because it's really not saying you're the only one at fault here, because let's face it, in interactions, both people play a role. One might play 100%. More than the other, but how do you accept influence? How do you allow and open that vulnerability for that?
And it could be something as, in terms of the threads, right? As simple as, I brought up a topic and I didn't realize you were already at a 4 or a 5 out of 10. I didn't get your permission to bring this topic up, knowing that it might poke the bear. I wasn't supportive prior to this conversation or during this conversation, right? Trying to find, and if you don't know what that is, by the way, ask your partner.
Curiosity.
Right? Going back to that curiosity piece of, hey, I'm really sorry we got to this point. What could I have done differently to support you in this conversation? How could I have approached you differently? What didn't feel safe for you? Get curious. Like that default in a partnership can make such a difference.
It softens it. Yeah.
100%. Right.
And not, I'm sorry we got here fighting. Tell me, what did I do now?
That doesn't count.
No.
Why not?
I mean, tone of voice is it? I mean, our presence is it?
Posture. Yeah. If you're crossing your arms and closing your body, we look defensive, right? We didn't mention this earlier, but defensiveness, and you sort of mentioned it with body language, but it shows up in much more than our words. It shows up in the way I stare at you, in my smile line, in my arms, my posture. Am I turning my back towards you? Right? In conversation, I want to be open to my partner. So my hands are open. My body's open. I'm not closing down and turning away.
We're talking about a lot of details. And I just keep thinking to myself, this is why relationships are complicated.
So complicated.
There's just so many little things. Because even if you're making eye contact, well, hold on. Don't stare like you're about to murder them.
Why are you looking at me that way?
Yeah.
Hear it all the time. Yeah. I'm not looking at you anyway. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's hard because a lot of our Defensive strategies are outward, and we may not even be aware of what our face or our body is doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we're intentionally saying, now I'm going to cross my arms and turn my back to you. It is unconscious. It is your body's way of physically protecting itself.
And that's one thing that we can't see is our facial expressions. And so this is part of that, going back to the thread is, well, maybe I didn't have a facial expression that my partner perceived, right? And the key is they perceived it. It's not saying that it's your intention. And that's a big distinction is
that's big.
How do we understand and get to the point of my partner didn't intend that. I see what the action did, but their intention was not that. And that's what I see a lot of couples argue is, well, that wasn't my intention. Well, it doesn't really matter your intention because your partner perceived it that way. So how can we be more effective in our way to communicate that? That's not perceived in that way. We have to have this partnership to navigate that.
Using these as learning moments, right? Okay, if I didn't know that this thing I did, this word I said would elicit defensiveness, get curious. Hey, hon, I can tell I've upset you. Can you share with me what was painful for you or what I did or what in my body language so I can do something different, and then actually doing something different, right? So if my partner says, I hate that you look at your phone when we're talking, or
the you language though.
I know, but it happens. It happens, right?
I hate when we look at our phones and we're distracted and I want to be more present.
That would be ideal.
Yeah. The we language. If you don't know how to do it without you, just use we. And it also puts responsibility on yourself too, and not all on your partner, which helps reduce defensiveness. Yeah.
But ask them and then try to do something different. If you make a misstep, because you probably will, that's just human nature. Own it. Try again. Right? We talk about this so easily with kids that we're teaching kids how to regulate, how to not throw temper tantrums, all the stuff. We forget adults also still need this conversation. Yeah. It's not like all of a sudden we're cured from that as adults.
Hard to teach your kids when you can't do it yourself.
I've had those days. It's rough.
We're human. This is where self-compassion comes in. Yeah. And I think just exploring for yourself, a couple of big questions that I have is, what is it that you're defending in each of these things? So part of helping reduce the defensiveness is really change your perspective of what the goal of this argument is. A lot of times you miss the underlying message that our partner is communicating, although ineffectively through criticism. If we attend to the underlying message rather than kind of the outward expression or ineffective approach, that could help reduce the cycle. It only takes one person to kind of interrupt that negative interaction cycle and maybe reduce defensiveness, your defensiveness or partner's defensiveness.
With partners, we talk about that I hear partners say, I'm not going to do it first. They have to do it first.
I say, who's going to swallow the pill first?
Yay, people. It doesn't matter who goes first, because if one of you is pissed off, you're both going to have a bad night. You both are losing at that point. So just do it.
That's when I lean in and I say, you're both wrong.
It's so true. It is so true.
But they're more wrong. You didn't have
They did it first. It's no different than what our kids argue over, right?
Yeah.
So-and-so did it first. Doesn't matter. You are in this partnership. You've committed to this partnership. So you are committing to the resolution of defensiveness. Commit to that. Commit to volleying rather than trying to score on your partner.
Yeah. Focus on the long-term game instead of winning the short term. Because it won't work trying to win the short term, because then we start focusing on ourselves and winning as individuals and not for the relationship.
And sometimes with defensiveness, don't be shy to take a break. Okay. We talk about couples timeout or couples pause. If I'm already feeling cranked up at a 5, 6, 7, it's time to take a break, right? Solving in this moment probably won't happen. So I'm going to tell my partner, hey, I'm going to call a timeout. We're going to come back in a half an hour, say what time it is, to this location, and you have to actually come back. Use that time to cool down, to soften yourself, not to sharpen your sword, not to say like, oh, I'm going to get him when we get back. Use it to soften. Because if defensiveness is there, sometimes we need that break before we can let defensiveness kind of rest.
Or acknowledge it. Yeah. And there's the physiological piece too, because in defensiveness, you're in a aroused state.
Yeah.
So, and this is where you're kind of leading into the self-care piece too, that I think is important. It can help to reduce defensiveness and perception of being attacked if we're improving our capacity to manage stress, exercise, whatever self-care looks like, which we've had.
Go to therapy.
Work on the insecurities.
Yeah. Get the tools, right?
Yeah.
This is true of anything. if you don't have the tools to do something, you go and learn what they are. Mental health is no different.
Yeah.
If we grew up with shutting down or defensiveness or criticism, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And you don't have the tools to do something different, go find them.
Yeah, it's no different than going to a medical doctor. I have a physical symptom. I wonder what tool or advice they have for me to reduce this. Mental health, same thing. And that includes relationships, mental well-being, right?
And how do we then, again, model it in our home? How do we hold boundaries that model this? Yeah. If the people that I am with, my loved ones, are defensive, how do I approach them? How do I establish boundaries so I don't get sucked into this cycle?
And that goes going back to just what we said, right? Focus on the goal of the conversation. What's the underlying message? What do you want to get out of this? If you were to respond, what are you really going to be defending? And is that appropriate right now?
The curiosity,
what's going on with your partner? Like, why is this being perceived as an attack? Like, finding ways that we can be more effective at communicating, even because, again, our facial expressions, we might be pissed off from work, come home with this angered face, although I always have that face. Everyone thinks I'm angry, but my wife got to know that. And so she stops asking, like, what are you pissed off about?
It's hard. This is a hard one because we don't always know that we're there until we're like really in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And it takes some finesse to get us out of it.
Yeah. And it's going to happen. We're going to be defensive. We're human. If we can use the tools and even some of the stuff we discussed and be conscientious and make it a goal to interrupt it, it's going to be much better. Because if we just let that go rampant, again, it's not good for the long term of the relationship.
No. And your long-term happiness and well-being. Okay, this has been Relationships Inside Out.
It's not.
Where we talked about defensiveness. And we all have moments where we're defensive for a variety of reasons. We are inviting you to try something different. If anyone has any questions, needs some tools, tangible tips, we of course include the resources in the link below, but also feel free to shoot an email at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. Thanks.
Thank you.